Hey there, what's going on? My name is Jeremy. I'm from Winnipeg, Canada, and I'm going to tell you about how I spent this past year learning and loving printmaking. I grew up drawing a lot when I was younger, and I mean a lot. I would draw on napkins, scrap pieces of paper, and sometimes even my arm. But it wasn't until I was in a fine arts high school where I took a printmaking class, and that's where it started me on my love for making prints. On one of my most recent trips back home to Toronto, I went to an art store and I picked up one of these and a carving block because I just love learning new things. I started out by making small stamps with my illustrations. I practiced carving tiny details because it suits my drawing style and what I'm most drawn to. I started out with a few fun ones that were practical, and then I kept making more. And more, and more. I found that when I'm carving, there's a different part of my brain that's at work here. I mainly work with digital formats with my work as a video producer. I'm on a computer for most of my days when I'm editing, and I'm using a digital cinema camera. So when I'm carving and using my hands with a tool that's not digital, it's pretty cathartic for me. I'm able to listen to music, listen to a good podcast, or have something streaming like a movie or YouTube videos in the background. But mostly, I love to carve in silence. It's the only time that I make for myself to be quiet and be in the moment of carving. It takes patience and precision when you're carving because one slip of the gouge can mean removing an important detail in the illustration or an eye from a portrait stamp. From there, I moved on to larger illustrations and even bigger printed blocks, and moved away from things like carving stamps, just because I wanted to expand my illustration style on different paper stock. This really challenged me to push past the frustrations of not getting it right the first time and really learn from my mistakes. And fortunately, there's a lot of people on social media who are smarter, who are way better at printmaking that I can learn from, who have just given me some amazing tips on how to just ink and to carve. And they've been so amazing at graciously teaching me how to make it better. Better inking, better carving with using less ink, more ink. All the important things that I forgot when I took it in high school. What I love about block printing is that I can print on so many different surfaces, from cards to send to someone, or find Japanese paper to make it more like an art print. Or more recently, I tried it on a tote bag. It's a super versatile way of making art from the same block that I hand carve. So I'm going to go through a bit of what it takes to make a print. I'm going to go over what I use, why I use it, and how it will look in the end. These are the main tools that I use from the beginning of an illustration to a print that I can hold in my hand. I've got an iPad to refine and size my illustration. Here I'm able to see what my final size will be and what the proportion will look like with the design before I carve it. Then I print it and I transfer it onto my block. There are so many methods of transferring, from pencil etching, drawing by hand, or the way I do it because I'm able to transfer it quickly and precisely onto the block. I use an iron and a LaserJet printer combo to transfer this illustration. There are various tools that you can use to carve. These are called lino cutters, but they're also referred to as carving tools and gouges. This is what I use to remove parts of my surface that I don't want included in the print. You may have done this in school with an X-Acto knife and a potato to make stamps. The angle and pressure you apply to your tool will determine how deep the part you remove and look. So what I'm doing now is taking this part of the block and removing it. The black in this transfer will be the color of the ink, and the parts that are carved will be the color and texture of the surface that I'm printing on. Now that I'm done carving the block, I'll trim around the carving so that I can place it onto my surface with a bit more accuracy. Typically, I'll use an ink pad to do a test print to see if there's anything I've missed that needs removing from the block. Sometimes it's part of a leaf or it's a line that I need to make deeper because it's too fine of a detail. When the print looks good after the test print, I'll give the block a quick rinse so that the test ink doesn't show up on the surface when I'm making the print with another color. And so the next step is to get the ink onto the block and the block onto the paper. And so this is really one of my most favorite parts of printmaking because it's a lot of learning of how to use the right ink, the right amount of ink, the right amount of pressure to put onto it. And so I'm wearing an apron because I am messy. And so I already have my ink here that I've spread. And what this is, this tool is called a brayer. And what it does is evenly distributes the ink from the plate here that I have onto the block. You want even coat so that you don't have disproportionate ink on it. So I've already inked some on here, and so the point is to evenly coat the tool with the ink. And there's a certain sound you want to hear, and that's, they describe it as velvety. I don't mind that at all. And so as soon as you have the ink spread evenly across the brayer, making sure there's no little spots that you've missed here, that's when you ink it onto the block. And so with this block, you want to make sure that you get all the surfaces that you've covered. I've been using an oil-based ink here. It's great because it's great, easy cleanup. It's just soap and water. You just put it on and you can clean it up fairly easy. And so now that I have the ink onto the block, I use this press here. This is a tabletop press. What I love about it is that it's a great size for me to keep on my desk here. It's super easy to use. Even my 6-year-old son can use it, just the right amount of pressure. And so I have my cardstock here, our card paper here. And so registering it, there are a lot of methods of doing it with extra pieces of paper to mark where you want to drop your block so that you have a consistent and precise location of where you want it. But for today, I'm going to just eyeball it. As soon as it's on my card, put this press blanket over it, a felt press blanket, so that this block is able to rest on there and not stick to the block. And so with an even pressure on the press, and what this does is this wood piece pushes against the felt blanket onto the block, and the block onto the paper, hopefully for an even distribution. And with the right amount of pressure, I'm able to spread the ink evenly onto the card. So there's a little bit of trial and error to see how much ink you actually need to spread onto the block. I've learned to embrace the charm of printmaking with how each individual card looks different than the other. So here's a quick recap of what I use to make a print. I've got a laser jet printed design onto regular paper. I transfer it with an iron onto a rubber block, which then I carve using a carving tool to remove parts that I want included in the design. And after that, I use an ink pad to do a test print to see if I've got all my carves done right. Then I'll use my brayer to evenly coat my oil-based ink from a glass plate so that I can roll it onto my rubber block. I'll place that block onto my paper, and I use a press to apply even pressure onto a block and paper to make a print. Some of the things that I use that I didn't mention before that are helpful are some tools like this. This is a Baron. It's used to burnish or rub onto my paper to combine my ink and paper together. Sometimes I'll use it to put pressure onto my block if I've made stamps. There's also different materials that you can carve onto. There's linoleum or linoleum mounted on a wooden block. These are all a matter of preferences. But I mainly use rubber blocks because of how easy it is to carve into and for me to transfer my images onto. But what I love also about rubber blocks is that when I have little scraps left over from carving, I keep them in a basket above my workspace here. And what I can do with these is that I can carve little stamps for my kids or get them to draw a little illustration on there, and I carve them out for them to stamp. Another important tool that I use is called a slip strop, and what this is used for is to sharpen your carving tools, and putting care and love into your tools goes a long way for each project that you do. I also use a tweezer that I borrowed from my wife just to make sure that my eyebrows are in check for each project, but I also use it for my carves when there's a little piece of rubber that is caught in between the space, and so I use this to remove it from the block. I hope this gives you an idea of another form of printmaking that you can do from your own home. I've loved sharing with you what I've learned this past year and what tools I use and how to use them, and I hope that encourages you to make prints of your own. Happy printmaking.